It was developed by a number of influential military writers, such as Vladimir Tryandafilov and Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who endeavored to create a military strategy with its own specialized operational art and tactics. The concept of deep operations was a national strategy, tailored to the economic, cultural and geopolitical position of the Soviet Union. In the aftermath of several failures or defeats in the Russo-Japanese War, First World War and Polish-Soviet War, the Soviet High Command focused on developing new methods for the conduct of war. This new approach considered military strategy and tactics, but also introduced a new intermediate level of military art, operations. The Soviet Union was the first country to officially distinguish the third level of military thinking, which occupied the position between strategy and tactics. Using these templates, the Soviets developed the concept of deep battle, and by 1936 it had become part of the Red Army field regulations. Deep operations had two phases: the tactical deep battle followed by the exploitation of tactical success, known as the conduct of deep battle operations. Deep battle envisaged the breaking of the enemy's forward defenses, or tactical zones, for fresh uncommitted mobile operational reserves to exploit by breaking into the strategic depth of an enemy front. The goal of a deep operation was to inflict a decisive strategic defeat on the enemy and render the defense of their front more difficult, impossible, or, indeed, irrelevant. Unlike most other doctrines, deep battle stressed combined arms cooperation at all levels: strategic, operational, and tactical. History. Before deep battle, Russian military thinking had changed little over the course of 3 centuries prior to the 1920s. The Russian Empire had kept pace with its enemies and allies and performed well in its major conflicts in the run-up to the 19th century. However, despite some notable victories in the Napoleonic Wars and Russo-Turkish Wars, its defeats in the Crimean War, Russo-Japanese War and First World War, together with a series of defeats at the hands of Poland in the Polish-Soviet War, highlighted the inferiority of Russian methodology in organization and training. After the Russian Revolution, the new Bolshevik regime sought to create an entirely new military system that reflected the Bolshevik revolutionary spirit. The new Red Army combined the old and new methods. It still relied on the country's enormous manpower reserves. However, the Soviet program to develop heavy industry, which began in 1929, also raised the technical standards of Soviet arms industries to the level of other European nations. Once this had been achieved, the Soviets turned their attention to solving the problem of military operational mobility. Primary advocates of this development included Alexander Andreevich Svechin, Mikhail Frunze, and Tukhachevsky. They promoted the development of military scientific societies, and they identified groups of talented officers. Many of these officers entered the Soviet Military Academy during Tukhachevsky's tenure as its commandant in 1921–1922. Others came later, including particularly Nikolai Efimovich Varfolomeev and Vladimir Tryandafilov, who made significant contributions to the use of technology in deep offensive operations. Roots of deep battle. In the aftermath of the wars with Japan and Poland, several senior Soviet commanders called for a unified military doctrine. The most prominent was Mikhail Frunze. The call prompted opposition by Leon Trotsky. Frunze's position eventually found favor with the officer elements that had experienced the poor command and control of Soviet forces in the conflict with Poland. This turn of events prompted Trotsky's replacement by Frunze in January 1925. The nature of this new doctrine was to be political. The Soviets were to fuse the military with the Bolshevik ideal. This would define the nature of war for the Soviet Union. The Soviets believed their most likely enemy would be the capitalist states of the West they had to defend themselves against before, and that such a conflict was unavoidable. The nature of this war raised 4 major questions. Would the next war be won in one decisive campaign, or would it be a long struggle of attrition? Should the Red Army be primarily offensive or defensive? Would the nature of battle be fluid or static? Would mechanized or infantry forces be more important? The discussion evolved into debate between those, like Alexander Svechin, who advocated a strategy of attrition, and others, like Tukhachevsky, who thought that a strategy of decisive destruction of the enemy forces was needed. The latter opinion was motivated in part by the condition of the Soviet Union's economy. The country was still not industrialized and thus was economically too weak to fight a long war of attrition. By 1928, Tukhachevsky's ideas had changed. He considered that, given the nature and lessons of the First World War, the next major war would almost certainly be one of attrition. He determined, however, that the vast size of the Soviet Union ensured that some mobility was still possible. Svechin accepted this and allowed for the first offensives to be fast and fluid, but ultimately he decided that it would come down to a war of position and attrition. This would require a strong economy and a loyal and politically indoctrinated population in order to outlast the enemy. The doctrine pursued by the Soviets was offensively oriented. Tukhachevsky's neglect of defense pushed the Red Army toward the decisive battle and cult of the offensive mentality, which along with other events, caused enormous problems in 1941. Unlike Tukhachevsky, Svechin determined the next war could only be won by attrition, not by a single or several decisive battles. Svechin also argued that a theory of alternating defensive and offensive action was needed. Within this framework, Svechin also recognized the theoretical distinction of operational art that lay between tactics and strategy. In his opinion, the role of the operation was to group and direct tactical battles toward a series of simultaneous operational objectives along a wide frontage, either directly or indirectly, in order to achieve the state's ultimate strategic target. This became the blueprint for Soviet deep battle. In 1929, Vladimir Triandafilov and Tukhachevsky formed a partnership to create a coherent system of principles from the concept formed by Svechin. Tukhachevsky was to elaborate the principles of the tactical and operational phases of deep battle. In response to his efforts and in acceptance of the methodology, the Red Army produced the provisional instructions for organizing the Deep Battle Manual in 1933. This was the first time that deep battle was mentioned in official Red Army literature.